Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the library for hosting this with us, the Larchmont Environmental Committee. I'm Lisa McDonald, and I'm with the Larchmont Environmental Committee, and we're really excited to have Luke Brussel here with us today to talk about native plants. Luke has lived for 20 years in Mamaroneck. He's a lawyer, he's a law professor, and he's been involved in ecological issues, namely native plants. They're part of his personal interest, it's part of his civic engagement, and it's also part of his professional life. Sorry, those are my kids in the background. He's worked for the last 3 years on the Sheldrake Native Plant Restoration Meadow Project. And he's also worked to restore the Sheldrake River, which is also known as the brook. So Luke, we're really, really thankful for all of the hard work that you're doing to restore native plants to our community. And we're excited to hear what you have to share with us today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for everyone who's decided to spend this Saturday, or at least part of it, listening to me. So what I'm going to do is I have a PowerPoint, which hopefully will be more interesting to look at than my face. And so I'm going to share my screen with you in a minute, and I will talk over that. When it's completed, then we can, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we could discuss any issues that you'd like to discuss. But we'll go through the PowerPoint presentation first, and then address things from there. So I'm starting just to orient us. I'm going to start at a very sort of the meta level of the issues we're facing, and then bring it into our hometown of town of Mamaroneck, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, and specifically what it means here, and the way we can solve some of the problems, specifically and mostly relating to native plants and ecological restoration here. So that'll all make sense by the time we get to the end of it. But we're starting out at the meta level. So but we'll quickly get home. So let me just share my screen here. Okay. So this is a couple of pictures from the recent restoration work that's been done here, and there's more great pictures to follow.
Luke, your screen isn't shared.
Oh, it's not? I'm terribly sorry.
Go run.
Yep. Give me 1 sec here. All right, back to Zoom, share screen.
Here, we got it.
Okay, perfect. Every other time I've done that in my life, I've gotten it exactly right. So I'm sorry that I'm just kidding. I often get that wrong. Okay, so the pictures that you see here are pictures of some of the plants from the restoration work that we've done here. And there are many more towards the end of the presentation. But it's really been, although it's addressing serious problems and troublesome problems, the solution is not only really makes a difference, but it is just a pleasure to be involved with, which is what keeps me coming back. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit about what ecosystems are and why they matter. So most of us know this, or at least know it intuitively, but all life is part of and dependent on interactions and relationships with other life forms. And an ecosystem is the interaction of life forms, biological creatures within a geographical space and with that geographical space. That's an ecosystem. And life forms within an ecosystem, generally, depending on the level of ecosystem we're looking at, but have evolved together, right, and have interactive relationships. Let me just, sorry, I was having trouble seeing it. And rely on each other for specific needs in their life and their reproduction cycle. And so when an ecosystem is damaged, so for example, a severe damage, when one of the species is made extinct, it affects all the other life forms in that ecosystem. And other species that evolved a dependent relationship with that species that is no longer there, either has to find quickly, right? So they may have, this one species may have depended, let's say, on a species of rabbit, may have depended on a species of plant within its ecosystem for thousands and thousands of years, and had evolved a specialized relationship with this plant so that it formed a large part of its diet. If that plant goes extinct, either is able to very quickly within one lifetime, right, out of the thousands and thousands and thousands of lifetimes that the species has been doing this, unless it's that one lifetime, it's able to find an alternative within its ecosystem, that species, the rabbit, will also go extinct. And so they're incredibly interdependent. And when any part of an ecosystem is damaged or becomes absent within the ecosystem, it has a dramatic effect on the rest of the ecosystem. Okay, so some of the current threats to our ecosystem that, of course, we're all aware of now. So global warming is one. Not unrelated to global warming, and one which myself am very concerned about, and we're not coincidentally was just speaking about, is that scientists have found and have published highly reliable studies that recently, in the last 2 years, that have found that there is a mass extinction underway across the planet. And alarmingly, they found unless the extinction is stopped and reversed within around 15 years, right, by 2030, 2035, it will become inevitable that the Earth will become uninhabitable for humans, right? So not that it will become uninhabitable in 2035, but according to scientists who are studying this, if we don't have this problem solved by 2035, there will be an inevitable decline that can no longer be reversed, that will render life on Earth uninhabitable. And again, there's a citation to this particular study that was done in some of the media that was around it, but considered highly reliable. And as we were just talking about, when one species becomes rare or extinct, the other species that evolved a dependency with it will also be adversely affected and can die off. And so the interactivity of ecosystem within ecosystems and then ecosystems to other ecosystems is incredibly complex and not fully understood by people by any means. But what we do know is that we're seeing extinction at a rate and a scale that's certainly unprecedented within human existence on the planet, and comparable to some of the other, in geological time, major extinction events. So it's connected to climate change as well. So some of it, there is the changes to ecosystems from the warming of the planet and the changing of the weather patterns and more intensely damaging storms, et cetera, that affects certain ecosystems, it affects certain life forms within ecosystems. And then also the die-off of plants and trees then worsens climate change, because of course we know that plants store carbon. They take carbon, and trees take carbon out of the atmosphere and store them, some better than others, right? And they bring atmosphere, they bring atmosphere, they bring oxygen into the atmosphere, which it enables the rest of animal life. So the more plant life that dies off and becomes extinct, it has a dramatic effect on the other species, but it also worsens global warming, which just intensifies the cycle. Okay, and then when it comes to global warming and mass extinction, I can remember back to the time when I was in high school, and there was a huge focus on South America, Central and South America, and how the environment was being mistreated there. And I remember the New York rock station at the time, K-Rock, did a big telethon where they were raising money so that the radio station, in connection with the World Wildlife Fund or some civil society organization, was going to buy acreage. I think in that case, it was in Costa Rica. So for most of my life, and certainly the time that I've been aware of issues of environmental degradation and climate change, there's been a disproportionate focus on Central and South America and the developing world more generally. But it's really not warranted. And if we continue to just focus on the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and other areas, one, it will be politically impossible to do what we need to do globally, but it also ignores the reality that we can do as much here as they can do there. It's just that we're at a different point in relation to our environment and ecosystems, which I'll explain a bit more. So the leading cause of mass extinction is loss of habitat. And just as in Brazil, they're cutting down a lot of the rainforests for agriculture and for their growing population. This happened here in the United States as well, right? A long time ago, about 100, 150 years ago, it exploded. And so we're just about, a century ahead of where Brazil is now. But we did something very similar, but we completed our task, right? So the entire central United States, the Midwest, Great Plains, out to the Rockies, used to be a vibrant, intensive plant ecosystem, right? What we now call the Great Plains. These were the great tallgrass and shortgrass prairies. And that's what formed the sod that made that area, central United States, so fertile when we turned it into farmland, right? But it was a wild area that stored massive amounts of carbon for a huge amount of geological time. And what's left of it now, all but 0.1% of the Great Prairie has either been plowed under or paved over, right? So the scale of it is hard to imagine, but it supported herds of bison in the millions. It encompasses probably more than a third of the landmass of the United States. And it was, in terms of a carbon sink and a diverse ecosystem, one, if not on par with the rainforest, certainly one of the most diverse and abundant ecosystems that in the world. And it's all gone except for 0.1%. And we did it, right? So we made our farms so we could feed ourselves and the world. And Walmarts and houses and things we need and things we don't need. But that's our responsibility too, which is not to say shame on us. I don't think, certainly in the beginning, we didn't know any better, but it's to say, well, there's work that we can do as well, even though we've already plowed it under and paved it over. It's our responsibility to restore as much as we possibly can, right? Moral blame aside, I don't know where the moral blame gets us at this point, but as a practical matter, I think we do have, if we want to turn around mass extinction, global warming, and the foreseeable end of human life on planet Earth, we need to think beyond what the small things that we're doing and make some significant changes. So, and there are many changes that we could make here in which, small and large, in which our lives are also bettered, right? So we also have in the United States 40 million acres of sod lawns, right? Just lawns, not agricultural fields, football, sports fields, just lawns, 40 million acres. And sod lawns, the grasses that are used for that, by the way, are Eurasian grasses, right? Even Kentucky bluegrass is not from Kentucky. That was just a name they gave to it to make it popular here in the States. It's actually from Eurasia. And I'll go to another slide to show you, but the lawns are like a ecological desert for all other living things. It doesn't provide the nutrition, the habitat that native plants and a more vibrant set of plants in the wild would provide. And so it's just a negative in terms of just a black hole when it comes to the necessary and beneficial properties of grown land with vegetation. Okay. Oops, sorry. All right, so let's go to now. So that's sort of the big world overview. So the town of Mamaroneck itself, the ecosystem health within the town of Mamaroneck is generally pretty poor. And from the data that we have, getting worse. So we know that each year we lose trees, right? There's a net loss of trees in the town of Mamaroneck every year. Those actually get reported out. And we're losing the old growth trees and have not been replacing them. So, we all are familiar with the hundreds-year-old oaks that we have, and the huge tulip trees that we have, the tulip poplar trees that really make the landscape here so intense and special. We're losing those every year. So I know that just anecdotally, just within a quarter-mile radius of where I live, I've seen just in the past 2 to 3 months, 3 big old oak trees, like big old oak trees, come down from private land, just cut down. And those that to me appear to be healthy from seeing them beforehand and then seeing the inside of the tree after it was cut. And it radically changes the landscape, and it very much changes the ecology of the area as well. And being near the Sheldrake River here, a big old oak tree will take in thousands of gallons of rainwater. So in terms of the flooding that we've experienced there and the cleanliness of the water in terms of there being a healthy ecosystem within the river and then in the lake that it feeds into, and not having the lake completely covered with algae, even one 200-year-old oak tree makes a difference. It cleans like thousands and thousands of gallons of the water and holds it back. It gets caught by the tree and then released over time, and some of it evaporates so that it lessens the flooding. So, and there's very little controls over that. That we'll talk about more too. Invasive within our wooded areas, so along the Leatherstocking Trail, and then in the Sheldrake Center, and a couple of other remnants that we have around town. Invasive plant species just dominate them, right? The understudy, right? So not necessarily the big trees themselves, but everything underneath, all the plants and shrubs and vines and all the life underneath the trees is, I would say, and this is anecdotal, 80 to 90% and upwards of invasive species, right? There are areas there that are just all burning bush, which is an invasive imported plant that looks beautiful in the fall, so people grow it, but it replaces everything in its path and provides none of the benefits that the native plants do to the ecology there. So, and that is only getting worse, it's, I don't know, I can tell you, the more you get the more you increase your ability to identify invasive plants from native plants, it really changes your experience of being out in nature. Because if you're walking in what looks like otherwise, beautiful woods, but you see that 90% of it are invasive plants that are expanding outward to take over other areas, and that nothing else is going to live there, it lessens the experience, but it can also be an important motivator. It's always, I like to think, better to know more. So we also now have a population density in the town of Mamaroneck that is at well above the level to be deemed an urban center. So a high population density. And of course, cars and other vehicles, ubiquitous. And most of our private property open space is dominated by non-native turf grass and imported, or not always invasive, but they don't always spread, but non-native shrubs and vines, and some of those are invasive. I would say if you go into the woods, you'll see that there'll be, half an acre covered with English ivy, and inevitably you can follow that to the edge of someone's property, and you can see where it came through the fence, right? It always comes from someone's private property where they don't care for it, and there's no controls around that in the town of Mamaroneck, which takes us to the next issue, which is that the town tree and invasive plant laws and regulations are weak to non-existent, and that is something that I've been trying to get changed, but it's difficult to make change happen in that area. I think that, unless it's very easy to have a view that, in fact, we have really great effective laws here, and that our ecosystem is pretty darn healthy, the way that folks tend to talk. So I think there's a lot of good intentions. There's no doubt about that. And I think there's honest feelings of commitment to the environment, but somehow there's a huge disconnect between that and what actually gets done, and the steps that the town government actually takes and won't take, a big disconnect. So why that is, I couldn't answer, but that's for sure. So for example, the town tree code, and there's a group of us who are trying to change this now, and I hope that we will. But this is something that for, most of my 20 years here, I thought, well, we're a tree city, we're designated by a third-party organization, so we must really protect our trees and make sure we're restoring trees when they die, replacing them. But in fact, it turns out that over 90% of the properties in the town are exempted from the tree code entirely, right? So in fact, it only applies to 10% or less of the town. And then for the 10% or so of the town that it does apply to, there is no clear empirical criteria for whether you can cut down a tree or not. So it often comes down to, who's going to push hard, or who knows who, or, whoever's making the decision, do they want to push back? But it shouldn't be that way, because there are clear criteria that we know should be factored in, and it can be on an empirical, consistent basis. So I can't tell you why it is that way, but it is that way, and it's important to change it. The reason, by the way, that it's 90%, the way that 90% are exempted is there's a clause in the law that exempts all properties that are less than a half. It only applies to properties that are larger than half an acre. And in the town of Mamaroneck, that's less than 10%. And again, it's not that that 10% can't cut down trees. It's just that they need to get a permit. Otherwise, you can just do it at will, which people do. So then the public land is managed by the highway department. But the highway department, right, these are the guys who are responsible for the roads. They are not trained in land management. And they are not trained about ecosystem or working with living things and sensitive ecosystems. But they are the ones that are responsible for it. They're the ones who do that work. I have some pictures down the line. That approach does not work. That approach has caused a huge amount of damage to the ecosystem, and continues to on a regular basis. There's an easy way to change that, which is you see how, the number of hours that the highway department, man hours, the highway department dedicates to those environmental projects every year, and reduce the headcount of the highway department in proportion, and add that headcount to the conservation department so you can have no net gain, no incremental gain in costs to the town, but you have the correctly trained people with the right expertise and the right interest doing the work that's appropriate for them to do. There's just no reason why it should be the way that, at least no good reason I can think of, for it to be the way it is right now, except for inertial. Okay, and then also, the first day that our county executive, George Latimer, came into office, he signed a executive order that made every single plant that is going to be from that day forward put on county property has to be a native plant, right? It has to be, and was knowledgeable enough and had the right people advising him to do that. So that's been the law of the county for, I guess, about 4 years now. It is not the law or requirement in the town of Mamaroneck, and the town continues to plant imported and sometimes invasive plants in public spaces. Okay, but which is an easy thing to change. And I hope we can change that sometime tomorrow. Okay, so a bit more on why native plants matter. Okay, so first, what are native plants? Native plants are plants that were here, right? Species of plants that were here at the time of the first European settlement, right? So anything that happened before that, still native, right? But almost all of those, I mean, there were, a relatively small number of people who had traveled here before. And so generally, these are plants that evolved here evolved with one another here, and with the native insects and birds and animals and other living things that live here and evolved here over long periods of geological time, right? So many of them, because they evolved together, formed interdependent relationships, right? Where they rely on each other for specific needs, food, shelter, or reproduction, and simply have no alternatives, right? They have to lay their egg, like milkweed to a monarch, right? A monarch butterfly has to lay its eggs only on milkweed, or it simply will not reproduce. And so there was a threat to the monarch population because people were cutting down all the milkweed. But there are many, many relationships like that in our ecosystem. And that's one of the reasons why native plants are so important ecologically, environmentally, because they support so many other plants and other living things, that without that particular kind of plant, they could not live. And we know there's been 30% extinction of all birds in North America in my lifetime. There is a massive rate of extinction, an alarming rate of extinction for insects, which of course we need in order to pollinate our food and for us to be able to feed people worldwide. And without the many insects, not just monarch butterflies, many, if not most, have specialized relationships that for one essential part of their life cycle with a native plant. So when a native plant goes extinct, so goes other species. And birds, many species of birds rely on insects and insect larvae to feed for their reproductive cycle, to feed their young. They don't, even though they eat seed, adult birds will eat seeds and other forms of nutrition. The babies, for many species, will only eat caterpillars and larvae. And so if you have a native plant go extinct and there is a moth or other type of insect that needed that native plant to lay its eggs, and which would turn into caterpillars, that's also gone. And the songbird whose babies need the larva from that insect, they're gone too. And so there's a cascading effect. Native plants are the base, right? The basis for many of our ecosystems, which is why they're so important. They also, hold on, I need a sip of water. They also have very, very deep roots. If you see all the way, that little mustache-like thing, all the way on the left, the first plant there, that's sodgrass. That's like Kentucky bluegrass. So Kentucky bluegrass and other grasses that we import for our lawns, generally they only have a couple of inches. Their roots only go down into the ground a couple of inches, right? You probably have noticed from time to time, pull up a hunk of it and it comes right up. Not true of most native plants. And you can see even the grasses, the fourth one in from the left, there's Indian grass. Its roots go down about 9 feet, right? And many of them, and this is typical of native plants, and I talked about it a bit in terms of the tall and short grass prairie and how it formed this deep sod that stored so much carbon. Well, that's largely because their roots go so deep. And because of that, they could also withstand a great deal of drought and changes in weather conditions. So they're very, very hardy. And as I say, store carbon and are the basis of life for all other living things that evolved here in this part of the world. They are also, it's sort of ironic that now many of them, to people who aren't familiar with them, which is most people here, many of them are very exotic looking, but they are actually the most common banal plants around for many centuries. It's just that we've now replaced them with imported plants, largely because at the time the imported plants were very exotic to the settlers and then the colonists and on from there. It is it's a great adventure of discovery to get to learn about and see and work with native plants because so much of it is new to us. So few of them still exist here in the wild. Okay, so some of the advantages of native plants I talked about: food source, right? Nectar, pollen, seeds, leaves, stems for all other living things. They also, because they evolved to live here, right? They do not need fertilizer. In fact, you should not use fertilizer with native plants because it only makes the weeds grow more. They can withstand drought, so you don't need to water them. You don't need to mow them. You can just put them in, and once they're established, the best thing you can do is just leave them there. And so it reduces the need for energy and for chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides. None of that is necessary. In fact, it all tends to be, in one way or another, either neutral or harmful for the native plants here, as long as they're planted in the right place. You still can't, if it's a plant that grows in the mud, you still can't plant it up on the rocky hill. But if you put it in the right, generally the right place, it's work-free once it gets established. And as I say, I certainly, it's very aesthetically pleasing and exciting, and it protects not just our biodiversity and our ecosystem, but also our heritage and the natural heritage of North America and the lower Hudson Valley. All the plants we're planting in the restorations we're doing at the Brook and at the Sheldrake Center, they're all native to the Hudson Valley and this area of America, and many of them have recently become extinct in this area, and so we're returning a number of a couple of dozen species to this area that haven't been here in a while. So it's kind of like I've heard people who are really into native plants call the plants you typically see at the garden centers gas station plants, because wherever you go in America, if you drive across the country, the gas stations, they're all going to have the same plants there because they get them from the big distribution centers, the Walmart, or I guess most of the garden centers carry the same plants. So it's all the same everywhere, but it really does make a difference, I think, in terms of the experience of those plants if they're local to your area and evolved there and are what people saw here, hundreds and even thousands of years ago. They're the real New Yorkers. But it definitely, I think, makes a difference. Just like going to a city, if you go to a mall in any city, it all looks the same. But if you go to a neighborhood in the city that's uniquely about that city, it's a much more fulfilling experience. So I'll quickly go through a little bit what we did with these restorations, just so you get a sense. And most of what we did at the restoration sites could be easily done in one's yard. Some of the, I like to choose, we had so much space to cover that I chose a number of species because they spread so aggressively. So you probably wouldn't want those in your yard, but most of the species are not very aggressive, and most would work very well in people's yards and look at home in their yards. But you still, either you or somebody, a landscaper who has an eye for such things, can make it really work. But because they're native to this area, they certainly would work in the lawn too. And like I say, once they're in, you don't really have to do anything with them. And it could also be just a part of people's yard. I know in California, like in the Bay Area, they go for like the full yard full of plants, but it can also be just like we have, certain areas of our yards that have taller plants or some shrubs, it can be part of a diverse set of heights and textures, to your liking. Okay. So basically there was great degradation to the Sheldrake River, the brook. Several years ago, the town had budgeted and spent a considerable amount to bring in experts to stabilize the banks of the brook and to, as part of the flood mitigation plan, after the big floods we had a number of years ago, to come in and plant native plants, right, all along to stabilize, prevent flooding, clean the waters, be beautiful. So unfortunately, over time, the town and the town contractors cut them all down, and so it's like, so we paid for the plants and then we paid to have them cut down, so that resulted in us back to soil erosion, depleted banks, barren soil, invasives like stormed in, very aggressive invasives, and the wildlife that had been there largely left. So there was no amphibians in the main brook, and it's still been about 3 or 4 years since there have been any ducklings there. There used to be ducklings every year. I'm hoping to get them back, if not this year, next year. But there was significant degradation, and the pond lake that it feeds into became thick with algae, and people were unhappy with that. So this, none of that. This was all a result of poor land management. And so here you can see, this is on the left there, the invasive species is Japanese knotweed, which is it's actually illegal to let it sit on property in the UK, because it's caused billions and billions of pounds in damage. If it gets next to your house, it will tear apart the structure of the house, the foundation of the house. It's kind of like bamboo, and it's not an unattractive plant, but if it's been taking over the Northeast the past few years, I drive up to Maine every year. If you drive up along the roads up north, you will see the landscape has changed, and now where there used to be a lot of sumacs and sort of recognizable vegetation, there's now mile after mile of Japanese knotweed, and its roots and rhizomes go down several yards into the ground. And if you get even a piece of it, live tissue, onto the soil, it will reproduce and form a new plant and then a new colony. And so it actually is believed that it does not spread by seed in the US, and definitely doesn't in the UK. It spreads by tissue. And so the biggest way is through mowing. When the town and you'll see everywhere, so the town mowing contractors have like 10 different areas where they mow. Every single one of them has knotweed. And which means they just don't, and they do mow down the knotweed or part of the knotweed. And if you don't clean out your machinery equipment after you do that, you will spread it, and they have. And so that's everywhere now, unfortunately, and that is sort of beyond your amateur ability to get rid of. You really need a professional and quite in terms of this kind of undertaking, a very reasonable budget to get rid of them. And now they're into the retaining wall. It's really I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. It's a very bad situation. So there's soil erosion, there's depletion of any plants there. for much, it's barren soil for much of the area along the brook now. And then there's also a huge amount of invasive. So on the far right there, you see that's porcelain berry, which is another big invasive, but one that it takes a lot of work, but it was covering the meadow at the Sheldrake and we got rid of it. But it is a lot of work, but it can be done without, you don't have to be a professional. Knotweed is another issue. And then you could also see down on the right there, the depositing of cuttings in the river by the town contractor, collects, and it's unclean water. Okay, and then I don't know if everyone knows this, but the leaf blowers, right? And not only leaf blowers, but also the equipment that's used to cut lawn, so the mowers. And the town crews actually sit in vehicles to mow the grass. I have a video of that, but I will save that for another time. It's quite a thing to see. But each lawnmower emits, according to the EPA, the same amount of polluting emissions as 11 automobiles for minute by minute. And so if you just have one of those going on your block, my block this season usually has at least 2 going for a couple of hours every day, which now that people are working at home adds a new dimension. But so that would be like 22 hours. So basically the entire day, you have a car sitting on your block doing nothing but emitting fumes, right? When the work, it's totally unnecessary. And it also, it compresses the soil and it kills all of the insects, beneficial insects, and living things there. And it's just a terrible way to, one of the really damaging secondary effects of sodgrass lawns. It's so easy to do away with. This is the kind of thing, unless you disbelieve the prognosis for global warming and the extinction, mass extinction, then really there's, to my mind, no reasonable person would be okay with 11, using a machine that's spewing out 11 automobiles of pollution for no good reason, right? It's just crazy. It's like, it's ultimately suicidal. And so, but every block in our town, every day during the spring and summer and fall does it. And so it just doesn't add up. And we really need to do something about that. It would also make our lives so much better. Just the noise. Okay, but enough about that. So this is the restoration work we did to try to solve and lessen some of these problems. So this is a picture of one of we began with 3 sites there. So that, and they're now through, those 3 sites are 3 years old. We've added some more, and I've started during this winter and this spring so far, I've started seeding other areas along the brook as well. So hopefully it will extend out. It's been a lot of work to, the town's contractors, even though we had it, I've got the town to agree that I could do it before I did it. And I roped off the areas with signs, don't mow, blah, blah, blah. Nonetheless, the town mow crews would occasionally randomly mow down part of it. It's like, anyway, so I think we made a big enough fuss that that's not going to happen anymore, but I can't be sure. So this is sort of a nice little, this area in there, you see a number of different species of native plants. The purple one in the front is called New York ironweed. So not only from here, but named after our state, and a number of others. But I feel really good about that plot. And then on the left is a different area, and that's butterfly milkweed, together with some what's called tick seed. Is that the one with the saw blade edge, and some something I can't pronounce, the pink flowers. But that's a smaller plot and a drier plot, but that is now, that year I think was the first year, and you can see a monarch caterpillar right in the middle, kind of eating at, knocking off one of the flower stems. But that particular area has really come into its own, and is it's a really beautiful thing, especially the midsummer, I'd say. The other on the right is that same area, just a different shot. And you can see there's a number of different kinds of plants. There's hyssop, which I think everyone's familiar with, and there's mountain mint, and there must be around 20 plus species there, different species in just that one little, it's probably like 10 feet by, like 10 by 4 feet plot, but about 20 or so species. This is the third original site. You can see the brook through the plant, the vegetation there. And that's cardinal flower, just starting to flower. That was actually, I brought some mature cardinal flowers so people could see some color the first year. And there they are. Okay. There was one, all right, maybe it's coming up. So one of the great successes of the brook restoration is that, there had been, when my kids were little, I really wanted to be able to go down there and find amphibians with them, frogs and newts and stuff. And because I had enjoyed that so much as a kid, and there weren't any. So after the first year of putting in a bunch of plants there, and I think also just sort of cordoning it off made a difference too, but I started to hear a frog every once in a while. And then last year, we got a huge group of tadpoles, which are definitely bullfrog tadpoles, right in front of the, at the restoration site. So the brook goes for probably a third of a mile, half a mile through that neighborhood, but it's like right in front of the restoration site. And that's where the frog was, and that's where there was a muskrat, anyway, other animals, and they all seem to go right to this, somehow know that that's a better place to be. And so I felt like that was a huge success. So hopefully, I think sometimes bullfrogs take a couple of years to mature, to get legs and get out of there. So hopefully we'll see that happen this year. All right, so this is the meadow at Sheldrake. It was literally completely covered with invasive plants. Here you can see there's some space in the front that isn't covered with plants. That required a huge amount of time to remove them. So we had just removing invasive plants was literally hundreds of man hours. So I had great volunteers last summer, and both adults from the sustainability collab and teenagers, young college kids and high school kids who were awesome. And we cleared out just about all of the summer invasives. So here are some of the early plants. On the right, you can see red bee balm. That was actually there. There was a Girl Scout about 5, 6, 7 years ago who planted some native plants there, but it was quickly taken over by the invasives. But once we removed the invasives, some of her original plants were still growing. And probably my favorite are these red bee balm, which are really terrific. And on the left, that's a kind of beardstung or penstemon, eastern penstemon, and that attracts hummingbirds, although supposedly I haven't seen it yet. And then here's a spider on one of the buds, and on the right there, that's like a wet soil loving plant called monkey flower, but somebody thought the blossoms looked like a monkey face, which sometimes they do. But it's a nice one, and it also that spreads. And right next to it, the left of that central purple flower, the wrinkly plant there is boneset, which is I think a real marker of a healthy ecosystem. And that in the second year, we've been doing this, like really started to take off in a lot of areas of the meadow. So made me think we were making progress. Oh, and there's the tadpoles. You can see in the burst of light, the tadpoles there. That's from the brook, not the meadow. Oh, and on the right there, that's I think that's called, it's Canadian germander, which is in the mint family. And that also like is great for shade. Oh, and will form a nice little colony really quickly, which is cool. And I like the flowers. Also, for Larchmont, we have so much shade here that I know when I was an avid gardener of imported plants, it was really hard to do a lot of gardening on my property because we have so much shade. There are a lot of native plants that are beautiful and work great that naturally would thrive in the shade. And so I try to grow a lot of those to show people that you can have them in the shade. Like the cardinal flowers, those grow in the shade and they don't need to be in wet areas either. Okay, and then, so this is just, I think this is the end of it, but on the left there's orange butterfly milkweed with some what's called dog bane around it, which was there. It's kind of like milkweed. It spreads like crazy. And on the right is a kind of a sedge. I don't remember that particular kind, but you can see in the center of the red circle there, you can see its fruit. So they tend to flower and fruit in June, way earlier than most plants do. And they have different kinds of sedge have like amazing looking fruits. They're pretty spectacular. And they're also, they work best in wet. Most sedges work best in wet areas and grow in the cooler months when most grasses aren't growing. So, and they provide great habitat. And I think we have a few types of sedge. There are as many types of sedge. At least there's probably thousands of different types of species of sedge. But the ones we put in are all native to New York, and I know at least some of them are have gone extinct in New York, so we're returning them here. I think all in all in the meadow, there's something like 20. I can't remember. There's at least a couple of dozen, probably like 3 dozen, either threatened or extinct, endangered or extinct species to New York that we've returned there. So pretty cool. And the other thing I noticed was, yeah, that's the end of it, was that, and hopefully we'll come out of this as an end note, is that I think that one of the reasons why there are no, I think that at a certain point, the native plant population gets so small that it no longer can reproduce itself. And then there's no seed bank in the area. So even if you have land that they could grow on and conditions where they would grow, there's no seed for them to grow them. And so one of the choices I made were plants that do heavily seed and that are eaten or spread by animals and birds, so that we can get restore not just a few of the plants, but a seed bank so that they can, to the extent that they're able to, repopulate in our open spaces on their own. Hopefully others will be inspired to clear out a lot of the invasives. And maybe we can even get the town to do it. And then we'll have the seed bank to fill those with native species that will create a vibrant habitat. Okay, so that was very long, I know. Thanks for those who stayed all the way through. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. or you could always email me anything from the practical to the semi-esoteric on native plants. But if there's any questions now, I'm happy to answer a couple. All right, so let's see. Julia Schneider. I think you have to unmute yourself, Julia. Or
Hold on
Paul.
one second, Luke.
Okay.